Welcome, everyone. We are talking Week 10 wide receivers in this video, which should be another extensive list. But before we get there, please check out promo code CURVE for weekly memberships on rotocurve.com. What does the promo code get you? It gets you, exclusive rankings, projections, cheat sheets for each week of the NFL season, must-have tools like DVP rankings, points per attempt, red zone, that sort of stuff, optimized lineups so you can double check that you're being led in the right direction, access to player ownership percentage. So again, use promo code CURVE, pay only $5 instead of $7 for your weekly membership. Jim, we've determined we like a lot of cheap quarterbacks and expensive running backs, although we do like, at least a cheap running back or two. So what do we do at receiver this week?
Yeah, well, in cash, like I said, I'm going to try my best to get some, like you even said, it's a week to have three running backs in your lineup if possible, as best possible. And for me, that includes Melvin Gordon and David Johnson, just because of their cost certainty of their floor and the sheer absurdity of their ceiling. I mean, both of these guys are kind of 200-yard multi-touchdown type guys. So that's just so rare. And like you also said, their price isn't comparable in terms of their production pattern with what we see on the receiving market. The receiving market obviously is more expensive because we have to source three of them, for example, on DraftKings. And that pushes the price up because of just market. There's more demand. But at the same time, I'm okay saving a little bit of money in cash. I know some people don't view this guy as a cash guy, but I do, as long as Jay Cutler's in the lineup. I like Alshon Jeffrey, actually. He got 8 targets last week. I expect that to continue, another 8. Most importantly, he had 3 red zone targets, and that's what Cutler does. Cutler peppers his favorite guys in the red zone. We saw it for years with Brandon Marshall. We saw it for that one full healthy year that Alshon had, was alone with him. And he put up, 11 touchdowns, I guess. But he's a touchdown maker, and he's a big guy, contested catch guy. You were going over how generous the Bucs defense, proves. I think that extends to their secondary and to this matchup. So, the Bucs are giving up an average of 26.4 fantasy points per game to opposing receivers. That's using ESPN, scoring, which really isn't much different than the templates on these fantasy sites, on these DFS sites. So, that's tied for dead last in the league. I just think everything between matchup and increased usage and the fact that he's only 6,400. Another guy in that same price point, I want to get shares of going against this New Orleans team when I can. Even with Delvin Breaux back, we haven't seen any shift in their secondary in terms of allowance. I like Demaryius Thomas a little bit more than Emmanuel Sanders. I know Sanders has the higher target rate, but I just think Thomas is a little bit better in terms of, being in the red zone and his rapport in there. And, he's got double-digit fantasy points in all but 2 games. There's almost an advantage to the fact that he's the security blanket. Sanders is the guy who gets the ball 12, 15 yards downfield. Thomas doesn't have the yardage upside in the sense that he's getting a lot of these comeback routes, but I just think his floor is really high. 6 receptions, 80 yards, a touchdown. That meets cost at least, and I think there's upside for more. One more guy in cash, so my third cash guy, if because these guys all seem affordable if you think about it, is Jordan Matthews. 25 targets his past 2 games. You mentioned about how Wentz is going to have to pass the ball. He's been passing the ball over 40 times recently. I think that's going to happen again. In terms of you have a Falcons, you have the best offense in football coming to town. It's a 50-point pick 'em. And I think the last 2 weeks is where you've seen the shift in the offense, where it's an offense that relies heavily on Sproles, Matthews, and there is some reliance on the tight ends, between Burton and obviously Zach Ertz had a good game last week. But I really think working the slot, being the guy who gets all these targets, I think he'll be facing Ricardo Allen or somebody weak, on the interior there with Atlanta. And Atlanta's been one of the most generous teams to slot receivers. So I just think everything works out for Matthews to have one of those 9-catch, 90-yard games that you kind of really love in DraftKings and Fantasy Draft.
We are fully on the same page here. I mean, Alshon and Matthews are definitely the guys I'm building around. Matthews has been a guy who, other than the Vikings, so a matchup against a pretty damn good secondary that includes Xavier Rhodes. He's gone at least 65 yards or a touchdown in every game so far this year. So we are definitely in agreement there. He's safe. This matchup makes him even safer. And as you were talking, I went on DraftKings because there's one guy that I think you missed, and that's Antonio Brown. Of course, we would like Ben to be healthy healthy, but even hobbled last week. I mean, Brown was a guy we saw everyone tilting about in the first half, tweeting about him. But when all said and done, I mean, targeted 11 times, 7 receptions, 85 yards, a touchdown. Typical Antonio Brown fashion. This Cowboys defense is good, but we're talking about the best receiver in football here. He is cheaper than Julio Jones, who I think is also viable. But in order to make everything work, I mean, you could go Wentz, David Johnson, the 3 receivers, Brown, Jeffrey, Matthews, and Sproles, and you could figure it out from there. I mean, that's probably what you're going to have to do. You're probably going to have to go cheap at tight end if you go that route. But, I mean, that's a whole lot of talent you got in there. So I think that's definitely the way to go in cash is you could spend at two running backs and at 3 receivers this week. That is a viable possibility. So I think that's definitely the way to go. I mean, we think these quarterbacks have as much upside as the top guys, so you're definitely getting a lot of guaranteed points there. How about wide receiver in tournament, because that's a little different.
Yeah, no, and I agree. Just to mention a tight end, because you're talking about complementing that team. I think Antonio Gates is like a $5,000 tight end who's still going in the 3 range. He also looks a lot better. I mean, he's getting the ball 13, 15 yards downfield. He was having 13, 15 yards per game earlier in the season. So I just think it's a much different Antonio Gates, and the market's not pricing him that way. But to jump into tournament receivers, Allen Robinson is a guy we're going to continue to talk about just because he kind of has that tournament profile. He's vertical. But, I actually think something happened. I went and watched the tape here. I do some of the AFC projection work for ESPN. And so I like to go back and kind of see what actually happened with players. So Game Pass is great for, searching for one player and seeing his snaps. Well, Allen Robinson got the ball downfield this week, and I know we've been saying that, but actually with some actual consistency. And the other thing is the run game that they applied actually helped afford a little bit of sellability, and not just play action, but also, the ability to push the ball vertically and have time. So I just think this is a good week for Allen Robinson in tournaments. I think it could be one of those weeks where he actually pays off. He averaged 11 yards per catch last week. It's basically his best game so far in terms of actual tape.
Yeah, he's a guy who I struggle through every single week because, the talent's there. I mean, he looks like a guy who is
– making crazy catches, right.
Yeah, he looks like he should be the next Dez Bryant. And then, you look at his line at the end of the week and it's 5 for 60 and you're like, what went wrong? So he's a guy I definitely struggle through. I think if you're going Matthews and Cash, there is some value at the other Eagles receivers. The problem is which one. Nelson Aguilar has been held down for quite a while now, but I do think he's the play. I mean, Dorial Green-Beckham targeted 5 times last week, did not catch a pass.
They can't trust Green-Beckham. He never comes up with the play. We've actually seen some plays where Aguilar makes the contested catch at least.
Exactly. So I think in a high-scoring game, this is a game where his volume could go way up. So I think there is some tournament viability from him. I would say if you're starting him, I don't think Wentz has enough to, sustain both him and Matthews as, $1 million in $1 million lineup. But I would definitely use one of them. If we're staying outside that game, there are some other ones. If you like Carson Palmer, I think you got to like Larry Fitzgerald, right? Obviously his top guy who sees, double-digit targets pretty consistently. So if we think, David Johnson maybe gets stopped at the 9-yard line out of pure luck because the San Francisco defense is so bad, then maybe, just maybe, they resort to throwing instead. And, even if they're throwing, I mean, Fitzgerald against a pretty bad defense has a chance to score from a decent way out. So I like him. I think that, Hayden, who's playing some better football now, is probably going to be on Wallace. So I think if we theorize that this Baltimore team throws it 44 times a game, that Steve Smith is probably a pretty good tournament play.
Yep, I like that.
Yeah, so I think that Steve Smith is a guy that you could rely on. I think he could even be a cash guy. If you're looking and you see that third receiver doesn't really work if you're trying to spend up for Melvin Gordon. I think he's a guy who could be slated in this cash, but he's definitely a better tournament play. You mentioned Demaryius Thomas. I like both him and Emmanuel Sanders against New Orleans. I mean, this New Orleans team is just not very good. If there ever was a week that Trevor Siemian was going to get it done, I definitely think it would be this week. I like Julian Edelman for tournaments against Seattle. Seattle's not a defense I love to
But
target.
in the slot is where they give up their points. So
Exactly. So I think, I'm not loving the outside receivers. I'm okay, lukewarm on Gronk. I think I like Jordan Reed better this week, but I definitely like Julian Edelman. I just don't love, targeting against the Seahawks in cash games. So that's why I will stick that way in tournaments. Did we miss anything at wide receiver? Maybe we should talk about Julio Jones before we go, because I think he is a pretty elite tournament play.
yeah, he's. I have seats at the Eagles games. I split a season package, and a couple of years ago they were in town, and it was actually so long ago that it was Nnamdi Asomugha, and it was the Dream Team season, and they lined up, and I swear I tell my friend, I said he's going to catch a touchdown here. It was a 76-yard touchdown. Julio Jones, he just is such a presence, on the field. When you see him in person, it's like he literally looks like Cam Newton in terms of the scale. But yeah, I mean, they're outside corners, and here's the thing: they move Julio around. They do a lot of trip sets and a lot of, they try to ISO the guys. I think you're right. I think they're going to get him in some good positions against Jalen Mills and even Nolan Carroll. That's the way to beat this Eagles defense is on the outside receivers because outside corners because they have a really good set of safeties. So I think I agree with you, and also just the verticality of Matt Ryan's offense right now. That was the complaint for him for years, and they never went deep. Well, that's all they do now, right? They're the Cardinals of this year in terms of the team that passes the ball 20 yards downfield with proficiency. One more guy, I'll let you take over some Julio stuff. One more guy, you mentioned Edelman in the slot. On the other side, I actually don't mind Doug Baldwin in the slot, just because I think we're going to see more pass volume. In terms of adjusted play rates, Mike Clay, put a cool stat up. The Seahawks are the fifth pass-heaviest team in the league right now in terms of, the percentage of their plays coming out as passes. That's obviously because they can't run the ball. They just can't run the ball on the ground. So I think, Russell Wilson looked so much better last week. He really looked like Russell Wilson again. And I know that Doug Baldwin doesn't have the volume, so I don't like him in cash, but he's still pretty cheap. He's like, I think, 5,800 on DraftKings. There's upside there. And obviously we talk about shootouts, but both of these offenses are pretty good. So I do think you can see 20-plus points from Seattle. And to me, that means that Doug Baldwin's involved.
Yeah, I'm gonna agree with you there. Baldwin was one of the guys that was high on my list that I just didn't get to. But Julio Jones, I mean, Odell Beckham made it look easy last week. If you're a big fan of their safeties, I mean, when they get to the goal line, you can't really double him or they throw to someone else. So it's gonna be Julio one-on-one with someone if they ever get there, and that could definitely be. And just one guy to remind you, I mentioned Fitzgerald, but J.J. Nelson was emerging as their number 2 as well. So I think if you're going Palmer shares. And you really like him, I would split him up with both Fitzgerald and Nelson, who, let's refresh your memory heading into the break. I mean, 8 receptions for 79 yards and 2 touchdowns. The week before, he was targeted 7 times, got 84 yards. They just named him the starting receiver. Only because he had the bye week do we forget about him. I don't think he's a guy we should forget about. So
he leads the Cardinals in routes over that time. He's got 100 routes over those 2 weeks. And he's a crazy burner, like a 4.28 40. That's 99th percentile among draft prospects. His closest physical comparables are John Brown and Will Fuller. So he's that kind of burner.
Exactly. And we know the San Francisco defense isn't good. And again, we liked the Dak stack last week with Ezekiel Elliott. I think we'll get to stacks, but Palmer, a receiver, and then when they get up, use David Johnson. That definitely could pay off this week. But that is all for us. This video, again, check out rotocurve.com, promo code curve, save $2 on a weekly premium membership. Things you get: rankings, projections, cheat sheets, must-have DFS tools like DVP, points per attempt, etc. Optimized lineups, access to player ownership percentage analysis after Thursday kickoff. Stay tuned as we'll finish it off with some stacks that'll hopefully win you $1 million this week.